The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
Well, it's nice to see the crowd's getting younger. You'll appreciate this. I was trying a case last year in December, and so I was talking to the judge, and we got talking about my client. We're at the bench, and the young prosecutor is probably, I don't know, maybe 40s or something. So he said, it reminded me of Patty Hearst, and the prosecutor said, "Who's Patty Hearst?" And the judge said, "You're kidding me. You don't know who Patty Hearst was?" I have no idea who Patty Hearst was. All right, the book is American Heiress. If you want, we've done this a lot of different ways. If you want to ask questions as we go along, feel free to do that. Anyone? No one's read the book here? No. Okay, see, this is an excellent book. I like coming out here because I get a chance to read some of these books, and I get a $25 Barnes & Noble card. But the books are good, and I read last night about 7 or 8 reviews on this thing from the New York Times and other people, and virtually everybody will tell you they really like this book. And if you go back to the 70s, a few of us here remember those times, it takes you back. And the book, it says that the title is The Wild Saga of the Kidnapping, Crimes, and Trial of Patty Hearst. So what Toobin does, Toobin can really write. He wrote a book called The Nine about the Supreme Court, which I did not read. His last great run or something about O.J., people read that and liked it a lot. He's a liberal, but the book is pretty good here because he gives a very nuanced view of Patty Hearst, who was Patricia Hearst. She did not like to be called Patty. And it starts off, as you might expect, he really sets this in terms of where we were as a society back in the mid-1970s. I saw the terrible thing last night, the 2 police officers in Iowa were killed, and we talk, you look at all the bombings today in Florida and everything else. In California in 1975, there were 50 bombings. You want to talk about a country out of control. And that's in California. That doesn't include Wisconsin or New York or Illinois or all these underground organizations, the Weather Underground, the Black Muslims, or the Black Panthers. All these groups, all the radical white groups who were bombing, who were killing. Susan Sachs from Albany, New York, who had the bombing, I think, in Boston. So, and I had forgotten about this, what our society was like at the time. And this is a time in the mid-70s when the world's getting tipped over. Nixon now, in 74, when she gets picked up, is almost set to be impeached. You've got the whole battle of the blacks and the whites and the riots, and not so much the riots, those are the 60s. You've got the young generation. And what he points out here, which is pretty interesting too, is if nothing else, Patty Hearst really became and stood for a symbol, which I never thought of. I don't know if anybody would care to guess at this. You probably wouldn't guess it. Maybe you would. One of the great symbols of Patty Hearst is the feminist. She became one of the symbol of the great feminist movement in the 1970s on. Gloria Steinem was there, yes, but Patty Hearst became the woman who stood up for women, and Emily Heiress and some of the other women, and this became this whole cultural thing happening in the 70s, which we can't believe now. The mid-70s, you had the beginning bubbling of the gay movement in this country. Gays are still but outed, gays are still being discriminated against, but this whole underground, this whole earthquake of movement starting to come along, which was occurring in the 1970s. And here comes Patty Hearst. The most famous kidnapping since when? Right. And he was guilty, by the way, the guy who they all try and claim later. I saw something last night on Hitler. They're trying to claim Hitler moved to South America, right? at the end of the war. I find it hard to believe, but who knows. 1974, she's living with her boyfriend, Stephen Weed. And of all the people in her life in this book who'll come across as a total jerk, it's Stephen Weed. Weed is disliked by everybody. Her father gets to hate him. His mother gets to hate him. She hates him. The FBI hates him. There isn't, and I don't think there's a good word about Stephen Weed in this book. And there's good words about a lot of people, but he ain't one of them. So they're living together. He's about 6 years older than she is, and she is somebody who was rich, spoiled, protected. She was very close to her father. Now, I don't usually read quotes, but he has a good quote here. He talks about the Symbionese Liberation Army, which is a group of motley people who kidnapped her. The kidnapping of Patricia Hearst foretold much that would happen in American society in a diverse number of fields. The story illuminated the future of the media, especially television and book publishing, the culture of celebrity, criminal justice, and even sports. The Hearst kidnapping itself had an effect on the politics of the 1970s. In other words, even though the kidnapping was an anomalous event, it provided hints of what America would become. So here she is, she's young, rich woman, living with this guy, and the Symbionese Liberation Army, SLA, finds out, and they were a group of about 6 or 8 people, and they just named themselves an army. And they just start telling people that they had this tremendous movement behind them, which was, none of it was true. None of it was true at all. But, so they take her out, and when they take her out, they kidnap her, and they put her in a closet. She's in a closet like for 51 days. So now it becomes, there's, and he does a good job about mentioning the people who were part of this symbol, the SLA. I'll just call it SLA. There was one black. That was Sin Q. That was Donald DeFreeze. He was the leader, and he was actually kind of he fancied himself after this man named Jackson, who had been one of the leaders, and it was a real radical and been in prison. And he was somebody who was smart, intelligent, and worked. And it could work the streets. Sin Q was a guy who sat around, drank a lot of plum wine, had sex with a lot of women, made these fantastic statements that people would say, "Oh, he's a genius." You know, it's funny, you see somebody who's a complete moron, but they say these things, and you say he must be a genius, and no one can figure out what they're saying. So what people used to say about Dylan, but there's a conflict but anyway. So anyway, they get the idea that they're going to kidnap Hearst. And of course, when they do, then they start writing letters and communicating with her father and mother. And if you may remember at the time, this becomes, I mean, unbelievably huge. There's press conferences, the father's giving all the time. He was close to her. She didn't like her mother, thought her mother was a real drinker, resented her mother. There were 3 or 4 girls, I think, in the family. And the Hearsts were not as rich as people thought. What I like about this book, it'll take you over to the corner and things. It'll talk about things that are germane, but they're just interesting. So in the Hearst family, George Hearst, the father, William Randolph Hearst rather, in the late 1900s and the early part of the century became very wealthy and very powerful, the Hearst newspapers. When he died, he understood something. I think he had 3 sons, maybe more, and they were all irresponsible. Her father, Patty's father, Randy, went to Harvard, dropped out, and they constantly get in trouble, get in debt, father bail them out, they drink, get in trouble. They just kind of recycled all this. So a lot of people thought the Hearsts had a lot of money. They had money, but not as much as people thought. So Sin Q and all the people begin to figure out, okay, now we got Patty Hearst. And what's amazing is that they never found her for a year and a half. She was in San Francisco, and this movement, they were living in 8 people are living in a house, and they're all together, and they're figuring out what they want to do. So then Sing Q comes up with this thing, I don't know if you remember this, which is a public relations masterpiece. He decides, instead of getting money, that they're going to buy food for all the poor in San Francisco. And Hearst has to go in and has to borrow like $2 million to feed the poor of San Francisco, which becomes a disaster. Because not just the poor are taking the money, other people are taking it, or it's the food, and it becomes a real problem. Also, before this, the SLA was isolated because there was a superintendent of schools in Oakland. And this is how divided the country was at the time. The superintendent of schools of Oakland was named Foster. He, let me see, it's in the book, I forget exactly his first name, but his name was Foster. And what he did was, he had helped turn around the Oakland school because there was a tremendously divided fight between the blacks and the whites. And the problem for him and his associate was this. They were trying to turn the school around, but the Black Panthers hated him because they thought he was white. And the whites hated him because they thought that he was not strong enough in terms of going against the whites. And so now, here's somebody who's in the middle of a divided community, the blacks, and they were very strong in Oakland back in the mid-1970s, Bobby Seale and so forth. The SLA comes up one night before they pick up Hearst, it's like, I think in November, and they take him out, and they take out the fellow with him. And that became a huge problem in the country and in Oakland. The SLA now gets isolated because the black groups, the Weather Underground, are not going to support him because he shot a black. And even the Black Panthers, who had a problem with Foster, are not supporting him. So now the SLA is alone, but you begin to see the division that's going on in the state. Reagan's now president. Randy starts negotiating with the killers or the kidnappers. People start thinking he's weak. She's on the board of trustees, I think, in the regions in California. This is Catherine. Weed is hanging around the house. They can't get rid of him. He's giving press conferences. Oh, Patty, I miss you so much. And Patty later says, I can't stand this guy. They've got the food drive, which is even, now everybody, oh, this is really a great community. And they arrest 2 people who were part of the killing. This was just a gangland shooting. What's amazing is the SLA committed a lot of crimes. They actually had a killing at a bank later in Carmichael in Sacramento, where a woman came in and Emily Heiress took a shotgun and blew her away. They never got convicted of that. It's unbelievable what they got away with. But anyway, these 2 men get arrested. The SLA now has her. Now what do they do with her? So they keep her in a closet, and Sing Q would sit at night and he'd spout these speeches, and some of the women, some of them were very, very intelligent, very impressionable. And remember back in the early 70s, you also had this whole Manson type thing. I mean, this is the context of everything. Remember Manson had all those followers coming in, and they'd follow him around, and they carved the swastika on their forehead, and he did the same thing. And to this day, I think some of those, Susan Atkins, I think, is still in prison. She's been in prison for 46 years, and they refuse to let her out. So anyway, they keep her, and I won't go through all the events, but so then they get an idea, because they don't have the money, we're going to rob a bank. And ultimately, she begins to get out of the closet and becomes assimilated with the SLA, and they get to like her. She gets to know them, she becomes part of it, and then they go to the bank, and they rob the bank. Now, if you remember, the SLA had the symbol of the dragon with 7 heads. And that was one of Sing Q's great designs, whatever it means. I'm not sure what it means. But so Patty was also a rebel, for example, before she gets kidnapped. The great book about George or William Randolph Hearst, which is Orson Welles, some people think the greatest movie ever made, Citizen Kane. She refused to watch it. Never watched the movie. I'm not watching Citizen Kane. And they had their quote, Death to the fascist insect that preys upon the life of the people. Now, she gets blindfolded, they let her out of the closet, they need money, they go and rob what's called the Hibernia Bank. And if you remember, that's the famous picture where Hearst is standing there with the gun. And it's a public relations, it's really genius what they did here. Because the SLA is now literally taunting the FBI and all the police agencies. They go in, they hit the bank, and it isn't a question whether she's there. Not only is she there with a gun in front of their symbol. And they come in, they grab like $11,000 or something. They come back out. And now the FBI, which in the most recent days has come into some more scrutiny, now they got a big problem. And they actually had an FBI man living at the house of the Hearst for a while. Now, the press, of course, is saying to them, and now you start to see the press doing something they'd never done before. Now the press is starting to really gear up, and you know, all these press conferences, it's now getting really active, and they're starting to feed on each other. And they're going to the FBI, what kind of idiots are you? You got a bunch of motley nobodies. You know who their names are, because they didn't know who they were. You can't catch them? And now you got her standing in front of a bank with a gun, and you clowns can't pick them up? And the FBI had a problem because the FBI had nobody on the street at that time. Had very, very poor street informants, whatever. So they had to rely upon the local police who didn't like the FBI. And SynQ now and the SLA start taunting them and said, we're over here. You know, they can't find them. And of course the press is now starting to really come after them and saying, I thought you were the FBI. You know, you got some kid, 20 years old. Well, ultimately, as you might expect, and she gets lucky, because what they do is they break out the groups. There's like, I think, 8 or 9 people in the group. And 3 of them, the 2 Harrises and her, Patty, they tell her they're going to run an errand. They go down to Los Angeles, because it's getting kind of hot in San Francisco. And I'd forgotten this. There comes a point in time when the police find out where they are, I forget where in Los Angeles, and they actually raid the house. And what's also interesting is this becomes the first time in American history, televised history, that they actually have a live televised event of an actual event like this shootout. And NBC has somebody who figures stuff out how they can do it live. At that time, what everybody had to do was, you'd go to a story, film it, send it back to your studio, they'd run it that night. But the local NBC affiliate had somebody who actually could do it on the scene at the time, which is, no one else had done that. So they show up, they find out where they are in the house, everybody knows they're in the house, and the NBC truck is all set to start the film. The problem is the CBS truck is already in front of them. So now, and CBS says, no, we're not letting you come in. So they work the deal then. So CBS and NBC says, all right, well, we'll cut a deal. You get your truck out of the way, we'll run a live feed from both stations. Done. So they do. So CBS and NBC now are running a live commentary of the 6 people in the house. There's 2 girls, Atwood and Perry, you'll see these names, Ms. Moon, they all had names, Camilla Hall, William Wolfe, who's Cujo, and he's important. And they just blow the house away. There's like 1,200 bullets or something. You just wipe them out. All 6 dead. Hearst and the Harrises, Bill and Emily, who ostensibly were married, would fight all the time. They're someplace else. They're actually robbing a bank at that time. Mel's Diner. So, and now the press is going, okay, you killed the 6, but guess what? Where the hell is Patty? She's out there somewhere. And they kidnap a kid, a young kid who actually is he testifies later at the trial. He's really kind of funny. Man, I wasn't too worried about it. Once I knew they weren't going to kill me, I think this is pretty cool. I'm here with Patty Hearst, okay. And he says, I got a problem though. I got to play in a baseball game tomorrow. So they say, okay. But they go to a diner that night. But you got to stay with us in the diner that night. So he's out there at the diner eating a hot dog, They drop him off. He said, it's a pretty cool event. And of course, it's Patty Hearst and everything else. But they're lucky. Once that happens, then they know they got to get out of town. And then what I didn't realize was they actually came east. I never knew this. I don't know if any of you ever knew this. They met somebody named Saga, who she falls in love with, and a couple other people. And they drive all the way to Pennsylvania and actually came in Westchester County for a while. They were hiding out in Westchester, which I never knew. So they're hiding out in Westchester. Now this is late 74, 75. The cops, the heat isn't as much. Now the press isn't following it as much. Where's Patty Hearst? If you remember the famous lines, where's Patty Hearst? Where's Waldo? No one knows where she is. She's back in Pennsylvania. And what the book establishes very much, and she's now sleeping with Saga, she's now part and parcel of this whole SOA. And they start talking about doing some things like bombings. The SOA people who were involved in this, and she met up with later, and the people that she met with first, some of them were a lot of talk. This guy, DeFreeze, Sin-Q, and some others, some of the women, like for example, this Ms. Moon on Foster. She walks over with Foster, takes a gun and on the ground, just blows them away. So this idea of these cute little girls, you had a group that was violent, would kill, there's no question about it. They knew enough not to, they wanted the public to be with them, but you had they were dangerous people. And again, it's the context of the 70s. We'd wake up, if you remember, and you'd see a bombing some post office, or remember Wisconsin and Madison, they blew up a lab. It was a real problem. So it comes 1974, they move on. 75, they get a tip, they arrest the Harrises, they go over, and lo and behold, they get Patty Hearst. Now, here's what's interesting. Patty Hearst has gone into jails. She's written letters. She's part of the manifestos. They issued the SOA manifesto and stuff like that. And he says at the end, Toobin, make your own decisions as to whether brainwashing became, I forget where that word came from, but this whole idea about the Stockholm Syndrome, how you identify with your captors, that was not identified at that time as a psychological, I shouldn't say disease, but condition. There's no question that when she's on the run with a group, that Patty is part of this group. She's in three. Mel Sporting is the second. The third one, when they're in Carmichael, and this was really interesting, they go into place in Carmichael in November of 74, because they always need money. And there's an older woman comes in, she opens the door for the robbers coming in, and what they typically would do is they'd have the guns, they'd say, get down, they'd swear at them, using not nice words, and Emily Heiress overreacts, gets scared, the woman stands, says, shotgun, blows her away. And, just absolutely destroys this woman, kills her. They come running out. Hearst is outside, and she's kind of a lookout. They come running out. They got some money, but now they got real problems. They had problems before. Now they got real problems. They don't have a bank robbery. They got a killing in a bank robbery. In California at that time had capital punishment, and so now there is no sympathy whatsoever for the SOA, and they know that Hearst is part of this. So that becomes a big issue later when Hearst finally gets captured. What's going to happen to her as a result of that bank robbery? She pulled that today, she's going to prison 25 years. No one's going to give her a break. So in any event, they take off. Mel's Sporting Store was the second one. This is the third robbery. They had some other small ones, I think, in between. They'd steal from cars and so forth. So they pick them up. And then they pick up the Harrises, and they pick up Hearst. And they have a lot of love letters from her to this Stephen Salia. Some of them were very sexual and very explicit. They arrest him. They arrest a whole bunch of people. And as he points out, she goes from kill the MFers At the time she gets arrested, to 2 weeks later asking for eyeliner. Patty Hearst could adapt. And what Toobin points out here very well, as I say, it's a very well-written book. She, in tough surroundings, for example, what's really amazing, when they throw her into that closet for 51 days, she doesn't freak out, she doesn't break down. Now, she's not part of them in the beginning, and she wouldn't cooperate with the book, but from other interviews, once she realizes it's not going to kill her, she goes, the hell, as long as I'm here, you know, might as well go along with it. Then she goes along with it. She's not a leader, but she's certainly part of it. There's no question she's part of it. She denies it. The proof is overwhelming to the contrary. She says, well, I was forced to do all this. It's simply not true. Once she gets arrested, she tells how she hates her mother and hates her father, and he writes a great line in the book. He said, the woman she hated the most, the person she hated the most was her mother, is who she became. At the end of her, I mean, now she's, I think, 60, 62 or something like that. So then now the cast of characters, these new lawyers who come in on her behalf. One family, the father was a lawyer, got disbarred, got readmitted. He's got 3 kids who are crazy. They're always fighting with people out in San Francisco. She comes in for bail. This lawyer puts a bail application in for her, which is crazy. She signs it, claiming she didn't do this, didn't do this, and do this. And as Toobin points out, there's no way she's getting out on bail. Because 2 of the big factors when you're going to get on bail are these. Number 1 is her flight risk. Yeah, I'd say they're a little bit of a flight risk. And number 2, are they violent? Well, yeah, they just killed somebody at the bank. There wasn't a court in the world who let Patty Hearst go anywhere, okay? After she gets arrested, Stephen Weed pops up again and gives a press conference. And so Randy says, you know, I ought to go down and beat the brains out of that little son of a bitch, you know, because he can't stand him. Every time he turns around, Weed is getting on TV and, oh, Patty, I love you, and get out of here. She's never saw him after the night she, and he took off the night they were kidnapped. They break in, he takes off, he's got a big, they hit him, but, hey, Patty, you're on your own. And since that time, they never saw each other. So now we go to the trial, which is what most people are fascinated by. And now the government comes in, and they're not buying this. They try her for the bank robbery, okay? And it got a pretty good case. They got a little Patricia, who's called Tanya, by the way, and she starts issuing all these public comments after she gets kidnapped. I'm not Patricia anymore. I'm Tanya. I'm part of the SLA. This is part of it. And when you start to see the progression of her statements, it becomes more clear all the time that this is not an unwilling participant. At first, she's nervous, and you can see that because they're filming it. But after 3 or 4 of these public statements, it's pretty clear that Tanya knows exactly what she's doing. So they try her. They try her in 1976 in San Francisco. And the trial, as he points out, you've got the kidnapping, the crimes, and now you have the trial. Actually, there's 4 things, because what happens after the trial? So Patty goes to trial. And at that time, they have a name named Browning, who was a U.S. attorney. Not a lot of experience. And frankly, a lot of federal attorneys don't have a lot of trial experience, because in the federal system, even then, most of them go to plead guilty. So you don't have a lot of federal attorneys who are it's not that they're not good attorneys. I don't want to even remotely imply that. What I'm saying is that when you're a street attorney doing a lot of street crimes, robberies, rapes, murders, that thing, you're in the court a lot. And you cross-examine a lot. So you're used to the courtroom. A lot of federal attorneys aren't, and he wasn't. So for them to gear up, and now the whole world's looking at this, Patty Hearst, because that trial, if you read some of the book reviews, is really a trial about society. It's about Patty, but it's also about how do we feel about women, and how do we feel about, you know, not how do you feel, of course we know about rapes, but being subjugated by men. And how do we feel about civil rights? And how do we feel, and the press, and this whole business of the anger that was existing in America at the time. which is amazing when you think today. It was nothing like it was back then. Anyway, so Patty Hearst hires F. Lee Bailey. And I thought at the time that she'd actually tried to get Edward Bennett Williams, who was a famous Washington attorney, who said that he wouldn't represent her because she'd already had a lawyer, which is bogus. I don't think Williams wanted to take the case. So they bring in Bailey. Now, Bailey is an interesting person, as many of you know. He's the most famous trial attorney in America at the time. About 40 years old. He had a couple of big cases, the Boston Strangler, the movie The Fugitive. He had represented Sam Shepard, what that's based on. He was a pilot. He had represented Medina in the My Lai massacre in Vietnam. Very public, ego. You know, he was huge. They don't say what they paid him, but I'm sure they paid him a lot. He also had another problem. He was a drunk, and he drank a lot. In fact, he used to say, you know, I got a little giddy up here. According to this book, there were times they said he was having 10 drinks a day. That's a pretty good, that's not bad. So Bailey comes in, and he's a pilot, and he flies his plane in. And during the trial, what he would do at times is he would try the case during the day, and then he would fly to Las Vegas at night to give speeches, drinking the whole time, or someone would fly in the plane. He'd come back, would drink, maybe even at lunch, whatever. And Johnson, it was a fellow who worked with him and known him for years, they'd grown up together, was the one who really babysat Patty. And he was the one who was working with Patty. Bailey's ego was such that Bailey couldn't care less, you know, I'm going to try the case. And the family got to dislike him after a while, Randy. He did a couple of things, though, that were pretty smart. He stopped the correspondence between Patty and her boyfriend when she got picked up, who she claimed later that he had forced her to have sex with him, but those letters don't exhibit a high degree of compulsion. Her father also said to Bailey, listen, I'm worried about that Carmichael shooting where she was a lookout where the person died. So we got to keep our eyes on that, because if they go after her on that as a lookout, which they could have, under American law, she's an accomplice. There's no question she's an accomplice. Accomplice to bank robbery, if nothing else, that's 25 years. Forget the shooting. So Bailey successfully got them away from the Carmichael thing, and he's trying the case, and he's drinking a lot. His ego's getting in the way, and Browning makes some mistakes, but Bailey also makes some mistakes. And it's easy in hindsight. I've tried a lot of cases, and it's easy to look back and say, what was that moron thinking? That's my decision at the time. But Bailey does a couple of things which really hurt her. And I remember at the time reading about this. He commits himself during the year that he's retained to putting her on the stand. Goes on Johnny Carson, goes all over the country, says, and he has a, listen, one thing Bailey has is a great voice. If you remember the OJ, remember he said to, who was the Los Angeles cop? Furman. Officer, did you ever use the N-word? No, never. You've never used the N-word. Of course, they had him locked down. That was that great cross-examination of him, of Wilmer. So anyway, Bailey commits her to going on the stand. They put the direct proof in. They got her in the bank. They got everything else. And they put psychiatrists on the stand. And as Toobin says, your brain hurts after a while because she's got 3 shrinks that say she knows what she was doing. They got 3 shrinks that she knew exactly what she's doing. The jury's going, hey, who knows what, okay? Because no one knows what the hell is going on. But she testifies. And some of the jurors said later, had she never testified, we'd have walked her. And that's always a tough decision. Any lawyer, do you put her up, okay? And he puts her up, and the biggest mistake he makes is Bailey becomes convinced that those other robberies at the banks, they would not be able to cross-examine her on. And the federal judge has given some kind of inconsistent rulings ahead of time whether he would allow that, because Bailey makes a big motion, an issue about, he makes a big issue about whether or not that would be something that she could be cross-examined. The trouble is, the law was not with Bailey. The law was against him. This judge did not blindside him. He just followed the law and said, if she takes a stand, I'm going to allow the U.S. attorneys to say, were you at the Mel's Sporting Goods? Were you there when you were claimed that you were being raped and pillaged and grabbed and beaten and everything else? Did you stand outside with a gun? And at Carmichael, when a person was killed and a woman was blown away, were you standing outside there, or were you yelling death to the Emmer? And he says, she gets on the stand, and he gets a ruling after she testifies, she cross-examines. So what does she do? What do you think she does? She takes the fifth. 28 times. The jury hated her. This isn't in Toobin's book, but they hated her. All of a sudden now Patty and on direct she was terrific. Now she's taking the fifth? Oh, really? But there's another problem. And I remember this very clearly. When she goes to the jail, there's recordings of her with people in the jail. She didn't know that, and they cross-examine her on that. She gets on the stand and she says, listen, I get raped, and this Willie Wolf, she called the kindest, gentlest person she'd ever met in her letters. She said, oh, no, that was all duress, and, they were raping me, and every time I turned around, he's doing it to me, and it was terrible and awful, and what could I do? I'm in the middle of all this. Okay. And she's very persuasive. A paralegal in the U.S. Attorney's Office says, wait a minute. When she got arrested, she had something on her. It was an icon or a Mexican bracelet, okay? I remember that. Let's go back and check that. So they go back and find it, and they get an expert to come on and says it's just a trinket. Nothing really mean anything. And they find out that this was a trinket, and I forget exactly how they did this, but anyway, that Wolf, the man that she claims was raping her, had given it to her. A year and a half later, she's carrying it around. And the paralegal, a young woman, says there's not a woman in the world who's going to carry around a trinket for a year and a half of the guy who raped her. Not happening. And they cross-examined her on that. And she did not do well with that. Well, I forgot about it. Jury said, that's it. It was a killer. It's one of those things that happen in the courtroom, those small things. In fact, I'll digress for a second. I may have told this story before. There was a man named Sonny von Buell who was accused of killing, or Klaus von Buell was accused of killing trying to kill his wife Sonny in Rhode Island. And Sonny was falling asleep, and he gave her a little, I don't know, maybe he gave her something to kind of put her in a deeper sleep. And so they tried him for murder, or attempted murder. I don't think she died. His fiancée gets on the stand, and she says, Klaus is a wonderful man. And I think the prosecutor said, well, let me ask you something. You're engaged, right? Right. Are you going to marry him? And she hesitates. Yeah. To a person, the jury said later, when she hesitated, I knew he was guilty. Never see it in the record. Never see it. Because I knew when she hesitated, she said, I'm not ending up like Sonny, on the sunny side down. That could be me next time. So that's what happens in trials. These small things, these big issues, all of a sudden this trinket's coming up, he's carrying it around, you're watching her in the stand, you're saying to yourself, I'm not buying it. So they convict her. And the judge, who's apparently sympathetic to her, ends up dying. And so a new judge comes in and has to sentence her, and he gives her, I think, 2 to 7, which really, under the she was hoping for probation. Patty, by this time, has adapted entirely. Great with mom, great with dad, the sisters, in jail, but, The family's great. Bailey's still drinking. Johnson's still taking care of her. She gets the 2 years. It gets even more interesting. Now, at this point in time, which I'd also forgotten about, speaking of society and how it was at the time, was the Jones Guyana thing, if you remember. Remember that? You know that don't drink the Kool-Aid? Jones was like, he killed, what, 300 people? I mean, people were killing and he's telling the parents, quiet your children. They were giving them Kool-Aid. I mean, it's a mass murder. It's unbelievable. And he was from around San Francisco, up in Northern California. So this is the backdrop of all this. Anyway, she ends up getting a lot of people behind her and moves for a commutation of her sentence. Reagan supports it. And Reagan at first thought the father was really too passive and too liberal, and you ought to stand up to these kidnappers when he's putting money out. He commutes a sentence. Carter commutes a sentence. They let her out. She would have only had another 6 months anyway, and the sentence wasn't bad to begin with. So Carter commutes a sentence. So then she goes out, she lives her life, becomes a member of San Francisco. She's not real public at that point. The Harrises, who were with her at the time that she got arrested, end up hating her. They end up serving time for the kidnapping and for the shooting in the Carmichael Bank, but it's only like 6 years. They do actually 2 prison stretches. And they absolutely hate Patty Hearst because they say Patty Hearst is lying about all this. She's absolutely lying. She was all part of us, and now she says she didn't know us. So if they went to trial, they were looking forward to taking her on as a witness. We now go to the late 1990s. And now Hearst gets it in her mind that she'd like to have a pardon. Why not? I mean, So then she starts a letter-writing campaign again. And Carter actually writes a letter to Clinton supporting it. But what's interesting now is the head of the FBI in San Francisco, who ultimately becomes, or the head of who's the U.S. attorney at the time, Mueller, who ultimately becomes the head of the FBI, writes a scathing letter to Clinton, says, don't you dare do this. She's guilty. She got away with murder. She's supposed to cooperate. She never cooperated. She's rich. To give her this kind of a break with other people who are actually maybe questionable, she is so guilty of a number of crimes, and he writes a very angry letter. Clinton commutes a sentence. The only woman possibly in American history who's had a commutation. He pardons her. Gets a commutation and gets a pardon from 2 different presidents. Nice to be rich. So, and he explains all this. So anyway, she gets married. She now is interested, and she works with a lot of dogs, and she lives a pretty quiet life. The other people, he traces the people in the SLA and what happens to them. And then he mentioned something that was pretty interesting about the Hearst family. As I told you in the beginning, the Hearst father, William Randolph, says he's got a bunch of kids, and he says, listen, if I give them any money, it's going to be gone. I mean, they can't manage $20, which is interesting. One of the great families, if you go back and look, forgetting whether they were, I don't know if it's nice people or good people, whatever. You look at the Rockefeller family. All those kids, all those boys held tremendous jobs. David was the president of Chase Manhattan. Winthrop was the governor of Virginia. Nelson was the governor of New York. Because the father made him work. They used to have, he worked his way through Dartmouth. Nelson, who was severely dyslexic, made him have a paper route. All those, he said, listen, you are not getting it for nothing. But Hearst, you got in trouble. Like, look at Jackie Kennedy, those 2 kids. And whether you like Trump or not, at least those kids, obviously someone's telling those kids, you're going to work. I mean, like them or not, there's never been trouble. Then you take some of the Kennedy kids, it's, who knows. But Hearst bails him out. But he's not that stupid, because he says, listen, when I'm gone, that money's going to be gone. So he puts the money in trust. And Randy gets divorced a couple of times, and he dies, I think, in 2004 or something. So one of the corporations that Randy has no access to, the trust buys, it's a sports network. When Randy dies, he owns 20% of ESPN, worth about $1 billion. That Randy had nothing to do with, absolutely nothing to do with. But he's like off the charts rich. Don't forget, in 1978, Randy's trying to scramble for money because he didn't have any money because he spent it all. He had to get it through his trust. So here's the questions now with Patty Hearst. Questions of malleability of character. What would you do if you had this today? So is Patty Hearst, she gets kidnapped, and there's a lot of strong things about Patty Hearst. They said she's the one thing about Patty Hearst is she's a survivor. I mean, it's frightening to think what would happen. You're 19, 20. No one in any way disagrees that they pull her out of there. She's in her underwear. They throw her in the back of a car. They put her in a closet, and she survives. Through a series of misfortunes, whatever, she goes through various banks, goes through robberies. She was part of it. She's part of that group. What about malleability of character? When do you stand up? And there, by the way, there was a number of occasions when she was out. For example, on those 2 banks, when she was outside, she could easily walk away. They're inside. All Patty has to do is go down the street and, "Hi, I'm Patty Hearst. What do you think?" And she would never have been convicted of anything. She hangs in there. The entire time she hangs in there. Then she gets arrested. Now, within 2 weeks, Patty's figuring out, well, you know, I guess my old life wasn't so hot. I'm heading this way. What would you do? What does that mean about her? And Toobin kind of raises these questions. He doesn't really answer them. He kind of leaves it to us. There's some parts of Patty Hearst, though, personally, that I didn't like. I understand the part about being taken over in the kidnapping and even the first bank robbery and that kind of thing. What would I do as the judge to sentence her? But this had gone on for a long time. And now for her to revert, and the stuff that really makes you angry is that takes a lot of chutzpah in the late 1990s. And don't buy for a minute, I don't buy for a minute, that my handlers, my people, went to Clinton. They don't go to Clinton unless they talk to her. Clinton, she's telling her lawyers, whoever's on her side, I want a pardon, knowing full well what had happened in the past. Now, why Clinton did it, that's another matter, but the point is, she became very lucky, very lucky. And for a lot of things that she did, Carmichael, she was never convicted of. Mel Sporting Good, never convicted of. The first one, which was an armed robbery of a bank, she got a very light sentence. And had that judge lived initially, he may very well have given her nothing. Yet Toobin points out, put yourself in her place. Now what would you do? So anyway, in a nutshell, that's a book. You will find, if you go to the reviews, everybody loves this book. You find very few people. Now, some people say they didn't do that, he didn't say this or that, whatever. But overall, the reviews of this book are excellent. Okay, thank you very much.